This is a video that I've been wanting to make for quite some time. And since the recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, I thought it would be apt to put it out there. There's always so much talk about the Israeli occupation, or how Israel is committing war crimes, or ethnic cleansing. But at the same time, we rarely hear anything about the Jewish people's right to self-determination, or their need for security. So today, I want to explore where we draw the line between empathy and anti-Semitism. Is criticizing Israel automatically anti-Semitic? Are Jewish lives less valuable than Palestinian lives? Do Israelis have the right to live free from fear of genocide? And what can we do to move towards a lasting peace agreement? Let's dive into it. So first, let's go back 100 years ago when the British were running the show in Palestine. The Zionist movement had been gaining momentum in Europe as Jews began to feel more and more persecuted, particularly after the Holocaust. In 1947, the British government asked the UN to come up with a plan to deal with the increasing tension between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. They drew borders on a map, sliced off a bit of land for the Arabs, and said the rest is yours, which was obviously not how it worked. The Arabs who had been living there for centuries weren't just going to accept this new reality. So when Israel declared independence in 1948, the surrounding Arab nations immediately went to war against them. And after 100 days of fighting, Israel had expanded its territory beyond the borders that were proposed by the UN. And this led to the creation of what we call today the West Bank, also known as the Palestinian territories. Meanwhile, the Arabs ended up creating what we call today the Gaza Strip. And ever since then, we've had this unresolved conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, of course, you could argue that this conflict actually goes back 1,000 years to the time when the Islamic prophet Muhammad conquered the region. But I don't think that's very relevant today. And it doesn't really help us find a solution to this modern-day problem. The vast majority of Israelis today are descendants of European Jews who moved to Israel in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most of these people had no connection whatsoever to the land besides being Jewish. However, you could say the same thing about the Palestinians. The majority of Palestinians today are also descendants of people who migrated to the area over many hundreds of years. And it wasn't until the 1960s that Palestinians started claiming that this land was theirs by birthright. It's easy to see how this conflict has dragged on for so long, when each side feels they have a legitimate claim to the same piece of land. So let's try to understand the arguments from each perspective. First, let's look at the Israelis. After the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Ever since then, there's been an ongoing security threat. Israelis have faced many terrorist attacks from Palestinians who want to establish a state of their own. And because of that, Israel has built settlements and checkpoints throughout the West Bank. But here's the thing. Would you build settlements and checkpoints if you didn't fear your neighbors? The answer is probably not. And it's the same for Israel. If they didn't fear another Holocaust, they wouldn't feel the need to occupy Palestinian territories. Now, I'm not saying that Palestinians are planning to wipe out every single Jew in the world like what happened during the Holocaust. But I am saying that the repeated terrorist attacks over the last 100 years have left deep psychological wounds on Israelis, causing them to constantly fear for their survival. Even though the population of Israel is only 8 million, they're surrounded by 300 million Arabs, which makes them feel vulnerable. And that's why you see so much support within Israel for the current government, which has been cracking down hard on Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, let's look at the other side. Over the last 100 years, Palestinians have gone from being the majority in the region to being a minority due to Jewish immigration. And because of that, they now live under Israeli military law. And this occupation has led to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. But if you look at the history of the region, before the existence of Israel, the region was called Palestine, and the majority of people living there were Palestinians. So it makes sense that Palestinians want their own state where they can be the majority. And even today, there's still millions of Palestinians living under Israeli military law. unable to travel freely, or vote, or speak their minds. And that's why you see so much support for groups like Hamas, which uses violence to fight against the Israeli occupation. Okay, so now that we've explored the two sides of the argument, let's look at where we draw the line. In my opinion, it's important to recognize the pain and suffering on both sides of this conflict. Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate reasons to feel the way they do. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that it's not okay to generalize entire groups of people. Not all Jews are racists, and not all Palestinians are terrorists. It's also important to acknowledge that things could have been very different had the UN plan been followed. But the world doesn't function on hypotheticals. And the fact is that Israel exists today, and there's no going back to 1948. So we have to decide how we're going to move forward, and there's been many attempts to try to find a solution. The most famous one is the two-state solution, which basically says that Israel and Palestine will coexist together side by side. There's also the one-state solution, which basically says that Israel and Palestine will merge together into one country. Then there's a bunch of other crazy ideas that no one takes seriously, like making the Jordan River the border, or putting God to the east. But the question is, how do we get to that solution? Do we use force, diplomacy, or something else entirely? One camp believes that the international community needs to step in and force Israel to withdraw from Palestinian territories. These people believe that the occupation is illegal and that Israel needs to be held accountable. If you ask me, I'm not sure how effective this strategy will be. Since the United States is Israel's biggest ally, they will likely veto any meaningful resolutions against Israel in the UN Security Council. Plus, America is struggling with its own problems, and I don't think they have the desire to send troops into the Middle East. And if the Arab nations try to get involved, I don't think that will end well for them either. We saw recently that Iran attempted to attack Israel through proxies, and they ended up getting bombed by Israel's Air Force. So, at the end of the day, the only ones who can truly end this conflict are Israelis and Palestinians themselves. It will require concessions on both sides and a willingness to forgive. But without that, we're likely to continue seeing violence in the region. But what does that mean for us? Well, if you're an average person watching this video, I think it's important to keep a few things in mind. First, remember that this conflict has lasted for 100 years and there's no quick fix. It will take time and effort to find a lasting solution. Secondly, don't blindly support one side over the other. It's important to listen to both perspectives and try to understand where they're coming from. Thirdly, don't spread hate speech or misinformation. There's already a lot of that going around, and it's important to be responsible with the information we share. Finally, remember that there are real human beings on both sides of this conflict. It's easy to dehumanize the other side when they become a political football, but that's not fair to the people who are suffering. Remember that there are innocent civilians on both sides, and it's important to protect their lives. So, let me end this video with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Returning violence for violence, hatred for hatred, and oppression for oppression does not work. It only perpetuates the cycle of violence and perpetuates the dark inheritance of a divided world." As we wrap up this discussion, I want to encourage you to embrace empathy and understanding. By doing so, you contribute to building bridges of compassion and fostering a more tolerant and peaceful world. Thank you for joining us on this journey towards enlightenment. Until next time.